Okay, hello everybody. I hope you can hear me. If I speak too quickly or too softly, please tell me. Thank you very much for having me here in Tartu. This is my first time in Estonia, so it's very exciting for me. And thank you to Mariana, because a lot of the things she said will lead into my presentation as well. She did me a big favour, actually, because she introduced some big concepts and a lot of the philosophy behind this work. And my talk is more about a specific project, one project that I did in London, at the Museum of London. And afterwards, if you want to know more about other projects I've done or we've done as a museum, please ask. I also have some notes here which you wouldn't have had before, so if it's useful to have copies of those notes afterwards and maybe have them translated into Estonian, please feel free. Okay, so I work at the Museum of London. It is the City Museum in London. So, as you probably know, there are lots and lots and lots of museums in London. This one tells the story of the city. And it has a big collection from Roman times, in fact before that, prehistoric London, when there were hippos, rhinoceroses and things in London. Through the Roman time, medieval time, up to the Great Fire of London, which was in 1666. Those are called our old galleries. And then we have from there what are called our modern galleries, even though it's quite long ago, but through to the modern day, looking at a lot of social issues in London, so a lot of protest, domestic life, family life. And also the museum's collections are influenced by their previous collections. So the Museum of London was formed from a Royal Palace Museum and also the Council Museum. So there are actually a lot of royal artefacts as well. We have, for instance, the shirt that King Charles I was executed in and things like that. So that also influences the collection. In 2003, a museum was built in the London Dock area. It was called the Museum in Docklands. And later it was taken over by the Museum of London. So that is now called Museum of London Docklands. And it is sister museum to Museum of London. And this is the museum that I'm going to be speaking about today. The particular project I'm talking about today was based at Museum of London Docklands. As you would expect, it tells the history of the docks. And it is located in Canary Wharf. Once the London Docklands were the biggest docklands in the world, very significant site and a lot of wealth. As well as telling the story of people who worked in the docks and how the docks came to be, we also have a large gallery called London, Sugar and Slavery, which tells the story of London businesses' relationship with the transatlantic slave trade in the Caribbean and how money moved around, how the slave trade was based on the movement of money, and also how there was a campaign in London to end slavery, which incidentally was started by women. So I like that. So there's a lot in that museum. It tells a lot of stories, and it also tells stories to the modern day. And the modern day is one of the things that we wanted to look at for this particular project. So we wanted to talk about, the museum wanted to talk about the East End of London. So the East End is seen as a kind of, it's a physical thing. It's the east side of London, but also has quite a mythical history. And there are lots of definitions about what is the East End, where is the East End, where does it start, where does it finish. And there's a big debate in London about where that is, what it is, academically and kind of in popular culture. So the museum had two options. We could either make a story ourselves about where is the East End, what is the East End, on our own and give that out into the public, or we could speak to East Londoners and get their view on what is East London, where is East London. And that's where the philosophies about openness and participation And that kind of work comes into this project. We chose to work with Londoners because that's how we work. And I'm going to show you the end product of that particular project. So you're going to see a little film. It's 8 minutes long, and it shows a little bit about this particular area of London that we started with. So in the wider project, we worked with 6 different areas of East London, of the nature of them, the history of them, what they were. And the film you'll see here is the first area. The area is called Poplar, and the biggest road in Poplar is the West India Dock Road. So this film tells you the story of the West India Dock Road according to ourselves and local people. And Poplar is the site of a television programme that's on in the UK at the moment called Call the Midwife. And it tells the story of midwives in Poplar in the 1950s. And we knew through meeting people in Poplar that they didn't completely agree with the representation of Poplar in this television programme. They thought it made Poplar seem too old, too out of date with how things were at that particular time in the 1950s. So it was interesting to be able to have a dialogue and represent their area in a way that they felt they had more ownership over and they felt more connected with. So now I just need to work out how to play the film. Can I just click?
When ships come into the dock in the early 19th century, the crews have to leave. That's what you start to get in the surrounding streets, you know, the taverns, the lodging houses, the shops.
Me and my friend, we weren't 10, we'd go on our own and swim in the river.
We used to have a lovely time.
The West India Dock Company have to get their cargoes up into the city to sell it, and so they build a road to do that, and the road that they build is the West India Dock Road and the Commercial Dock Road. Initially they create work as the docks are being built, and then when the docks open, the dock company rely very heavily on casual labour. Chinatown is really established by sailors who are brought back on East India ships or tea clippers, and they all settle in a very small area of Limehouse adjacent to the West India Docks.
There was no other restaurant, there was no Indian restaurant, there was nothing else. But there was one in Shaman's Lane, I can't think of the name of it now, and a lot of the stars, like people like Roger Moore at the time, people like Shirley Bassey and all that, and they used to go and visit this particular one, you know.
They used to have Packapoo along here. Packapoo was a gambling. When you walked by, you could hear shh, shh, shh.
During the 80s and 30s and 40s, especially in this area, we get a number of sailors' homes.
The people have always been foreign round here, like all different. There's always been round here.
East India Dock Road. There was tailors down there, there was a bike repair shop, there was a bookshop, there was a police station.
It was quite nice round here. We enjoyed it. We all played in the street, skipping rope, hopscotch, knocking down ginger. But we found fun being out in the open, you know.
I think the best free thing is just hanging out. The streets are the young people's streets. You know, they're just as much as my street. We've had a group of young people who've gone through the whole process of growing up here in the club, then becoming volunteers. We supported them, you know, into going their directions.
You go down to Millwall Park on a Sunday and they have 4 pitches there and you couldn't get near the touchline. The amount of people watching. Now you're lucky to see one man and his dog these days.
You could have a bath there, you had wrestling, they had dancing, they had swimming, boxing. It was all in that one big place. Friday night used to be at the Theatre of the Queens, where you've got all the old stars. I think that is where most of them started off, at the Queen's Theatre. I sang up there once. I'll take you home again, Kathleen, across the ocean wild and wide, to where my heart has ever been, since first you were my bonny bride.
When I was about 6, 7, 8 years old, I used to go to Saturday morning pictures.
So you had to wait for one lot to finish before the next lot went in, so you spent there many of hours standing out there, if it rained, whatever.
And most pubs in East London had a piano player. You don't see this today.
And my uncle used to play the piano, the other one used to play the accordion, and Friday night we'd have like a little ding-dong, a little sing-song.
I mean, you've got to remember, people used to hold their weddings in the upstairs and all that sort of thing. People paid their loan club. When I say loan club, they should save up for Christmas.
Charlie Brown's was basically a very, very popular pub, and it became popular really from the 1890s.
It's the first port of call for many people coming in from all over the world. That was the first. We meet you in Charlie Brown's.
You know, sailors would come back from the Far East and would go into the pub and would say, I've just brought this back, are you interested in buying it? And Charlie Brown gradually collected, all these sort of cultural artefacts from various parts of the world.
Should never have been pulled down. It was really historic in its way.
I didn't know the West End much. I can remember my auntie saying to me, she said, don't you ever go up Soho, she said, because they shoot you. I didn't even know where Soho was. And I can imagine there with machine guns at the doors shooting you. So you wouldn't dare go up there.
When this area is regenerated, you can look to your left and you can see the West India Dock Road, you can see the traditional area of the East End. And if you look on the right-hand side, what you see is sort of the glass, towers of Canary Wharf.
Nothing round here really anymore. Like the pubs, you just have old men in, so it's not like people our age, so we can't really mingle with anyone.
Canary Wharf has like Wetherspoons and that, so they're better places, and yeah, no trouble.
We had somewhere to go, where I don't think they've got anywhere to go. They've got money and all that, but nowhere to go.
And good night and God bless you all. Thank you.
Charlie Brown's it was notorious, but I can remember my auntie saying that when she was young, one of the princes or that came by on a horse. He'd been in there.
What they done, they used to issue what we call a dock token, but they didn't used to hand it out. They used to just throw up in the air, and everybody used to scrabble and fight for it. And of course, if you did manage to get one of those, that fed your family for half a day or a day, if you got one of those tokens. Most people never got selected, and that's why I got the area of blues, because you'd be upset because you never got the job,
Where was you? In the morning, you'd go up West India Dock Road, before Canary Wharf was there, of course, and there'd be the dockies. Hello, girl. How's your mother? How's your auntie? How's your Aunt Raya? And all that. People would all talk to one another, and then they all look at... I've said hello to people and they've given me a look.
Bum Daddies, yeah.
Yeah,
There's a pub called Bum Daddies.
It's still there
now.
in East India.
It's the Manor Arms.
It's the Manor Arms.
Should tell you.
But the story goes that the seamen would come in and borrow money or leave something, anything to get a few bob. And one day the dad was ill and the son was there. So he said, I'm sorry, Daddy's not well. There'll be no more bumming off of Daddy. And that was that's how it goes. I don't know if it's true.
Everything was nearby. I mean, if you went home and your mum wasn't in, you'd say to yourself, I'll go round to Granny, who lived round the corner, you see.
I think community is what you make of it, and you're part of it. If you're in a community and you think there's no community, it's as much your fault as anybody's. It's up to you to be part of that community.
Now come on, let's see you sit underneath the arches, I dream my dreams away. Underneath the arches.
Okay, so that is the end. That's just right there. Okay. So I know there were a lot of thick accents in that, and you might not have picked up on all of the information, but basically there was only one voice in that was a member of staff from the museum. All the other voices that you heard were people that we worked with who were named at the end. And it meant that we heard stories, we could contribute things to that animation that we would have not known ourselves. We just didn't have that lived experience or that family experience. So it was really valuable for us. And this comes back to the question of why co-curate. So there are lots and lots of terms in this field of work. Co-curation, participation, collaboration, and they're all on a spectrum of how much you work with other people, but the way we see this is as a two-way process. So obviously the museum has knowledge, and we want to get that out into the local community and online and to our audience. And to the people that we worked with. You know, the museum has an academic knowledge of East London that the participants did not have. But equally, they have an area of knowledge that we don't have. You know, you can't learn everything about an area just by reading books. And I would say that that is a fact. And so that was brought to this project, and it does mean that people can engage who do not necessarily engage with an academic process. And lots of people, when they're visiting a museum, even if they can engage with an academic process, might not want to. They might be on a day out, they might be just with the kids, you know, so having that layer of fun can give you something that you don't get otherwise. Also, I think there is something to do with respect with this work, and it's about the fact that museums don't own knowledge, and that if you're telling the story of a local area, then it's respectful to work with the members of that area. And that also comes back to the museum, because if you show respect for the people around you, they appreciate that and they will invest back, and that goes from person to person, and they will come back to you again and again. And we have found that in a lot of the work that we do. And as I said, you unearth things that maybe you wouldn't have known before. Oh. The challenges of this work are that it does take longer than doing it on your own. Obviously, we know this. If you work on your own on something, you can control it fully. You get to do whatever you want on the time frame that you want. If you're working with other people, you have to factor that into your plan. And I would say that that's a really important area of this work. It's going to take longer. That's not a disadvantage, but it's a fact. And you need to plan that into your project. Also, it removes control, which is a difficult thing for a lot of institutions. And I'm not saying that at the Museum of London that was not an issue, because it really is. And I would say that the process of releasing control is a long one, and I don't know that the end game is necessarily to release full control, but you do have to remove control to work with other people. You kind of related to those two facts are the fact that your contributors, your participants, have other commitments, and that will factor in when you work with them. Family, other work, maybe even other voluntary work that they're doing. And you need to remember that this might not be their top priority. So when working with people, you need to, you know, not get frustrated if they are doing other things. And ultimately, you have more people to answer to. So if there is a disagreement, that's going to be more challenging than if you're just working on your own and you think, I have one story, I'm telling it in one way. So yeah, so I'm not going to hide the fact that there are difficulties to working like this, but I think it's a really exciting way to work. I think it makes museums richer, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. So now I'm going to tell you about the people who worked on this film. First of all, we had our museum youth panel. These are three of the members here. On the film, they were named first as the concept developers. So these are 3 of our concept developers, and they helped us in a number of ways. So they conducted the interviews with the older people that you heard on the film. They did some of the animation. To do an animation like this is an awful lot of work, if anyone has ever worked in animation. I hadn't before this. So they couldn't do a great deal, but they did a small amount of the animation. And they also spoke to young people on the street. So they did some street interviewing with recording equipment. And because they're young themselves, that meant that certain young people who might not have spoken to me or one of my colleagues would speak to them. It was a really good way in. And also, obviously for these young people, it developed a lot of their skills. So now on their, we call it CV, I don't know what you would call it, like resume or something. They have these skills to take forward to university, to take forward into work. So it's really great for lots of reasons. We also worked with local youth workers. So these 2 youth workers you see here are not youth workers of the youth panel. They're separate individuals. And that meant that they had an overview of young people in that area. They could tell us more about bigger pictures rather than individual stories. Also, they're local themselves. John, on the right, was a member of the youth club before he was a youth worker. And Roz has worked there for a long time, and lived in the area for a long time. They can tell you a lot about, trends and different histories and things like that among young people. This is an organisation we worked with called Poplar Housing and Residence Association. So, as you can see, this is a group of older people who meet every day, actually, to do different activities. They do cooking, they do art, and as you can see from the Google picture, they live very, very close to the museum. They meet very close to the museum. And so they could tell us a long history of this area. They're very forthright in their opinions, which was very useful for us. And working with older people, I would say, is a very rewarding process because you have to win trust more than with young people, I would argue. Because they have seen people come to them before and ask them for their opinion before, and if you don't use it in a constructive way, they're going to be less trustful of giving you their time. So we had to prove that we were going to honour their opinions, use their work, not just go in and grab their opinion and run away. And so they came with us on that journey. They took part in the interviews. One of the ladies you saw singing on the stage was actually from the other organisation. Neighbours in Poplar is another older person's organisation in the area. And lady on the right there was the one singing on the stage. Again, it's obvious, but older people obviously know a lot about the area. And if you can work with them in the right way, they can tell you a lot of interesting things. I've put on here staff because it's really easy in a museum to forget about the knowledge in the staff pool. And by that I mean that often there will be one curator maybe on a project, but at the Museum of London we have 200 staff. So just because you've got one staff member working on a project doesn't mean you're using all the knowledge in your staff pool. So we worked with people who worked on the reception desk, we worked with cleaners, everyone in the staff pool, because they all knew something different. And again, if you have the time to build that into your project, it's very, very useful. Because you might say hello to the person on the reception desk every single day, but not actually ever work with them. And they might know something really valuable. So I would say, don't forget about your staff. It's a really, really useful part of this work. Okay, so to give you an idea about this particular film, I wanted to tell you the kind of scope of it, because this was a big project and it was well funded, as you can see. So yeah, we had about £14,200, around-ish €17,000 for this project. Given to us by the Arts Council in England, which now gives money for museums. And that is a lot of money. And it's easy to look at that and think, oh, okay, so it's easy to do a project like this if you have thousands and thousands of pounds. And yeah, if you want to do a big animation, it does take a lot of time and that takes money. But the principles are the same, even if you were doing an A4 piece of paper for a guided tour around the museum. Because you could do that on no money. We've all got Word. We can all print out a Word document. I could do that on my own if I wanted to do the history of East London for visitors, or I could do it with local East Londoners. So those principles about working with other people and allowing time to develop those stories are the same regardless of your budget. Your budget obviously determines what you can do. And on this particular project, we had what is called a full commissioning process. So that means in the UK that you have an idea and you advertise that idea, and then artists come to you with how they're going to do that, how they're going to realise that. All we really knew before we started this process was that we wanted to talk about East London, we wanted to talk with Londoners, and we wanted it to be an animation. It wasn't really much more complicated than that. When we produced the pack that went out to artists, there was a lot of information in there about time frame, when we wanted to display the film, all those kind of details, but not really conceptual or artistic details. Those came from the artists. We had 15 replies and we interviewed 5 companies, and in the end the company that we chose were really passionate and wanted to work in the way that we worked, and that's why we chose them. And it took a year. So even though it's only a short film, that process took 1 year. Okay, so just so you can have some things to take away today, I just wanted to reiterate that point that the principles are the same regardless of the shape and size of your project. It's about who gets to tell the story, really. And the key to that, and the key to the success of that, is forging and refreshing relationships. And this was mentioned before about not just doing something and leaving it there. And I think really we all know this in life. It's just easy to forget it in work, that you would not expect a friend to keep talking to you if you called them once and never spoke to them again. You know, you have to refresh that relationship. And it's the same with participants, people outside of the museum. People know that if you're being genuine, and if you just rock up and say hi and then go away, they're not going to trust you. Whereas if you keep refreshing that relationship and showing that you're really there, you really want to hear what they're saying, they're part of the museum as much as you're part of the community, then I would say it will be successful. In my personal experience, and I've been working in this kind of work, not only in museums, but in youth and community work for like 12 years now, I would say going in person is still absolutely the best way to do anything. So if somebody you know knows there's a youth centre down the road, or there's an old people's home down the road, just go there. I would really just do that. Even if when you get there it's not a convenient time and they want you to come back, I would do that rather than emailing and rather than phoning. There's lots of email going on now, and email is great for lots and lots of things, but I would say it's not as great as meeting someone in person for this work. Also, finding about what are the local effective means of communicating with people. So, for instance, in London, if I want to find a youth group or a community group, it's much better for me to use Twitter, because local people are on Twitter and it's a simpler form than using Google. Now, I don't know if that's the same for everywhere, but if you do use Twitter, or if you know Twitter, I would say it's really useful for finding groups. I've put on here logistics, and this is about planning your project and budgeting, really. If you have a budget, I would put most of it towards feeding your people and getting them to you if they need travel, because that will be what makes or breaks it for people. That's really what we spent our money on, apart from paying the artists. As you can see, the older people were very frail. One of the women we worked with was 95, and even though she lived just down the road, she couldn't really walk it. And having her involved meant paying for a taxi for her to come to the museum. And that's not possible in every project. Obviously, that depends on the budget you have and if you have money. But we had money and we could pay for a taxi to bring her to us, which meant that we could have her stories. And it was, for her, she said it was really life-changing because she had been on her own in her house for a long time. Nobody had really wanted to speak to her or spend time with her, and we were able to break that cycle as part of this project. After that, I've put ask and then keep your mouth shut, which is just a good principle, I think, sometimes. So to ask people what they think of an area and then keep your mouth shut. It's quite simple. It's very easy to go, oh, and I think this, and I think this, and oh, do you mean this, and do you mean this, and and to fill that space. Whereas people will fill that space for you if you let them. So we would say to people, what do you think? Where is East London? And they needed time to think about that question, and then there would be some silence, and then they would fill it. So if you're working in oral history or any of these kind of methods, ask and then keep your mouth shut. Document with photos. Sounds really obvious, but it's a really important thing to do. Take as many photos as you can. This, again, is probably common practice to you, but if it isn't, remember to tell people you're going to be using those photos for things. That you might put them online, you might use them in your reports, because some people do feel uncomfortable with being photographed, and we had people on this project who would not be photographed. So, don't forget your own staff, as I said. And then this is just for information. If you wanted to know, the youth panel, excluding this particular project, we ran it on £1,300, so I think that's around €1,500 in the past year. And that was meeting them every 2 weeks to do different things with them. So their involvement in this film was not their only involvement with the museum. They did lots of other things with us. But there's about 80 people in the youth panel, of which we see about 20 regularly. And the ones we see regularly, we see every 2 weeks for a different workshop, different London history. The rest are either in university far away, or they're caring for people, or they have other responsibilities and commitments. So they get involved in big one-off projects or big events, that kind of thing. For anyone who's interested in this kind of work, I'd really recommend this paper. Paul Hamlin Foundation is a British funding organisation, and they have been monitoring the work of this kind of area of work in the UK for about 10 years, and wanted to move away from funding projects where they gave money, something nice was made, but there was no long-term impact. There was no long-term change to the organisation or to the local community. So they have now announced that they're going to really invest in organisations who are doing long-term change and not just tokenistic projects. And that's where Whose Cake Is It Anyway came from, and it's a really useful report. It's big. You might need a little time to read it, but it's very good. And it's just if anyone had any questions.
Thank you very much. So, any questions?
May I? Thank you very much for the presentation. You're representing the Museum of London, and there is a British museum. I've been there. Sorry, I haven't been in the Museum of London. We are the Estonian National Museum. British Museum is very global. This is the empire. My question is, how many local London people visit the British Museum? Because I have a threat in my mind that we being the National Museum for Estonia, of course we are working, attracting global people to come, but we also need to work towards local people. How to break the ice between National Museum and the local people? Because the idea in my mind is that if I was the regular Estonian, I've been once in the National Museum and that's forever. That's enough. How to work if you are the national museum, how to work with the local museum.
Okay. Well, let's go to the previous. I mean, I won't talk about the British Museum too much because I don't know, but I know that the British Museum, something like 90 or 95% of their visitors are from overseas. So they do have a different problem in that. In terms of your National Museum in Estonia, first of all, I would say collaborating doesn't mean forcing something on people who don't want it. So if somebody does want to just go to a museum once and go away, I wouldn't drag them kicking and screaming into the museum. But there would be people who do want to engage, and there are various ways of starting that. So I would say in the first instance, put a page on your website saying you want to work with, with the project, whatever the project is, saying you want local involvement. Because surprisingly, I found this really surprising, but an awful lot of our youth panel members found us through just a page on the website. Even though it's quite buried and not on the homepage or near the homepage, they still found it because they were looking for it. So there might be people who are looking for this anyway, might be looking for volunteering opportunities, there might be people who want to gain skills in certain areas and start that way. And also I would just, you can leave things in the foyer, in the reception area. I would also be tempted to go out. I mean, find your objective, whatever the project is. Our objective with this was to tell the story of East London. So we had a reason. So you find out what your project is and then go to people locally and see.
Yeah, well, two quick questions, I guess. The first is about how did you have you kept? You talked a lot about this, the importance of having a long relationship with those who contribute.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how you keep up with that after the project has ended, because that's, in my experience again, often a big challenge.
Yeah. And
also, how many were you at the museum who were sort of dedicated to this work? Because I guess again, that's another key question.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Matt. So there's two things to say. First of all, in projects previous to this, the way that we kept in touch with people was by starting the cycle of the next project way before the first project is finished. So if you think about it as like circles, like Venn diagram, that even before you finish one project, you already are starting to think about your next project. I would always start by asking people, what do you want next? What are you interested in? Of course, some people don't want to be involved further on. They want to do one thing and close. But a lot of people that we work with want to stay involved, so we would ask them to start with. A really important way of keeping things going, I think, is by having a regular... I mean, these are really basic principles, but they really do work, and without them, sometimes you can go wrong. Having a regular day per month that we met them. So, for instance, at the Museum of London, I've worked with what we call vulnerable adults, so people who might be unemployed or have mental health problems, different problems, and we basically said that we would meet them on the first Tuesday of the month and the last Tuesday of the month, and there would be a workshop. And we might have planned the next 3, but we didn't know what we were doing in 4 weeks, let alone 4 months' time. But we told them, just come on the first and last Tuesday, and then we would plan as we went along. So things like that are very useful. The long term on this one is a really sad point, really, because, and this is where I wanted to be honest about this, because this work is quite difficult. Museum of London does have a reputation for this work, fortunately, which is lovely. Unfortunately, when we had a new director last year, that director didn't believe in this work and made our team redundant. So there is actually no long-term sustained relationship with these individuals. There are some staff members who are carrying on some work, but I'm not sure how long it's going to live without a dedicated team. which is not to say that it can't work without a dedicated team, but it is harder. Or a dedicated staff member, you know, one staff member, say. So, yeah, it's very hard without one person, yeah.
I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit on the work you are doing with the youth panel, because at least in the museums I have been collaborating, most of the friends of the museums are seniors.
Okay.
So I'm very curious how to motivate the young audience, and also in Finland there is a big problem with the youngers, like because of unemployment, and some of them they don't get a proper space in the education system when they are 18. So it could be great if they could really do something in the museum.
Yeah. Well, I'd say museums have got a really interesting opportunity to work with young people, particularly, like you said, disadvantaged young people, in the sense that, so our youth panel were aged 18 to 24, and I would argue that at that point in your life, well, this is true of every point in your life, but particularly at that point in your life, identity is very important. And museums can play a really interesting part in the discussions around identity, because we can bring to the fore stories from before and try and place people and get them to understand their place in a bigger picture. Because if you have conflicting ideas and you don't know where you are or where you're going, that bigger picture can sometimes be quite reassuring and interesting. So, yeah, like I said before, there are lots of, in London we found lots of young people looking for that, and a lot of them came to us. And as I'm sure you know, London has an awful lot of social problems, so there is people coming. I would say with the sharper end of issues, so people who are really vulnerable, maybe involving crime, maybe, you know, doing drugs, that kind of thing, probably you have to start a relationship with their support worker. So, and this is true of all this work, that it's very rare that you would go directly to very vulnerable individuals. Almost all vulnerable individuals are, in London anyway, involved in some kind of programme. So they have supported housing, or they have drug care, or they have a social worker. Almost all people will be involved in some, or a vicar, religious group, something. And if you go to that person first, then you can have access to the people that they look after. And we would often work with drug workers or doctors. Sometimes our work was prescribed instead of antidepressants. So yeah, so I would say there's so many opportunities for young people within this. And if, you know, make it obvious they can come to you, and then go to the people that they're connected to.
Thank you. You said that you have been working with the projects for 12 years, or different inclusive projects maybe. I wanted to know, as the question, or the conference name is openness, how much have you seen that museums have started to be more open, if you talk about the inclusion of people, or and which have been really the obstacles, what you find yourself like empirically in work with the museums?
That's a good question. I think museums have, in the UK, and actually globally from the examples that I've seen, have become more open. Certainly in the UK, under the last government, things changed a lot. There was an awful lot of money and funding going into this kind of work, and it did change the kind of stories that museums were telling, and that in itself, you know, changes the audience. So, for instance, one example of that is, I mentioned at Museum of London Docklands there is a gallery called London, Sugar and Slavery, about the history of slavery, and that changes that whole museum really, and has changed the audience that comes to it. My worry is that that funding is now being brought back, and this government, the current UK government, don't believe in that work as much, or at all, and that will have an impact on the audiences that come to museums and the histories that are told. I feel like in the UK at the moment, history is really contracting into being traditional white male story. And I'm concerned that that will continue. You said something else, I can't remember what it was. Was there another part to your question?
I was thinking more about museum stuff, maybe.
Oh, the challenges, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, there is lots of challenges. As you can imagine, you have to work with a lot of people, and working with a lot of people, whatever you're doing, even if you're making a cake, is hard, you know. And there is this fear of losing control, which I think really just comes from lack of experience. Because once you do it, you realise that actually nobody wants to do anything particularly damaging. In my experience, that's what I found, is that it's actually very positive collaboration and people want to come together for the same reason. But there is always a feeling of nervousness and lack of trust that something might go wrong. I mean, just silly examples, but once we did an exhibition with the youth panel where they got to design the colour of the exhibition. And somebody genuinely said in a meeting, what if they want to paint it pink? That will cause really big problems. And there's a lot in that statement that I don't understand. No one had said they wanted to paint it pink, and they didn't paint it pink. Not that that would be a problem if they had. But what was the problem if it was going to be pink? There was this real, and this comes from a real kind of feeling that young people are going to cause chaos and going to be crazy all over the place. And a lot of young people don't want to do anything particularly crazy. And so that, the fears that existed before that exhibition and the realities of what was a very successful, highly sophisticated, intelligent exhibition created by 20-year-olds were very, it was very different. But the fear is often there.